Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, one of the busiest and most exciting times in college football about to begin as the transfer portal opens up on December 4th. And I want to take a deep dive into this Nebraska program, talk about specific positions and players that they could be going after this transfer portal cycle. And I think it's important to remind ourselves, Matt Rhule took this job about 12 months ago and kind of went into the early portion of the transfer portal relatively blind. I mean, not really knowing the holes in his roster and the personnel that he has and what needs to be addressed. They took about 13 or 14 guys in the transfer portal, some of those guys coming in after spring. I would project and predict that Matt Rhule gets aggressive in the transfer portal this cycle as he has a better feel of his personnel and what holes that he needs to kind of fill up in this Nebraska roster. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys and specifically a shout out to the Nebraska fans. Many of you guys know, if you've been listening, this is a program that I really love talking about. Really big fan of what Matt Rhule is doing in Lincoln. And part of the reason I love talking about Nebraska so much is some of the best fans in the world. You guys have rocked with the boys and showed a ton of support. Can't thank you guys enough. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. But more importantly, would love to hear from you guys in the comment sections on particular players or positions you would like to see Nebraska go after in the transfer portal. It's going to be a busy next couple of weeks. We'll be covering as many of this Nebraska roster moves as we possibly can. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I feel like you got to start at the quarterback position. And to look at this Nebraska team that had 31 turnovers, went minus 17 in the turnover margin, both almost dead last in the FBS and still won 5 games. Like, that kind of speaks to how healthy this roster is at other spots. We talk about the defense extensively in terms of this is one of the best defenses, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. And if you can bring in a quarterback that has some experience, that's going to limit those turnovers and kind of revamp it and bring a little bit of more of a two-dimensionality to this Nebraska offense, it's going to mean massive things. I mean, you look at Nebraska specifically in the month of November and how one-dimensional they became on offense. And you know the identity of Matt Rhule is going to be running the football. And they ran the football relatively well at times, but when you're that one-dimensional, you have very little capability to attack that deeper third and make our defenses respect what you can do through the air. It's hard to have an explosive offense that's efficient and can put up points on the board. And that's kind of what you saw Nebraska go through in the month of November. And that's not to say a guy like Harburg or a guy like Purdy or a guy like Danny Kaelin is not going to come in and kind of earn that spot. But if you're a Nebraska fan, you're probably looking to add a veteran quarterback that's played at a high level at the Power 5 level to kind of supplement and add some experience and depth into this quarterback room. Want to talk about a few names that kind of have popped up for me. In the first one, this is going to be one of the more sought-after quarterbacks in the transfer portal, Will Rogers from Mississippi State. Few things that really stand out to me. Second most passing yards in SEC history at Mississippi State. Over 12,000 yards, 94 touchdowns to 28 interceptions. Takes care of the football. 70% completion percentage. Has experience in a pro-style offense his last year at Mississippi State and also that air raid under Mike Leach. Will Rogers is a guy that can spray the football wherever you need it to go on the field. And he's a guy that's going to open up this offense a little bit. And more importantly, has a ton of playing experience at an extremely high level. This was an all-SEC caliber quarterback that's now trying to find a new home. This would be the number one option for Nebraska. Will Rogers is going to have plenty of suitors. But if you're looking at a perfect scenario or one of the perfect scenarios, I think Will Rogers would certainly be included in that. The next guy I want to talk about, Tyler Shuck from Arizona, committed to Oregon, played 2 years there, went to Texas Tech, played a couple years there. And the story of Tyler Shuck, there's so much to like. 6'5", 230, really good arm. He's a winner when he plays. I mean, Texas Tech, I believe, record was 8-2 when he was a healthy starter for Texas Tech. The problem is the last 2 years hasn't been able to stay healthy. He hits the transfer portal. A guy that can get it done with his legs. He has a big body that can do a lot of things. Tyler Shuck would be a phenomenal addition, probably a day one starter for Nebraska as well. The only bugaboo here is, can he stay healthy? I mean, you see the ranking coming out of high school, top 100 dude nationally, the 6th quarterback in that 2021 class. Really exciting guy. And the last guy I want to go to, Nebraska fans, I have a feeling you guys will love this. Matthew Sluka from Holy Cross. He's been compared to the Tim Tebow of the FCS. You take a look at his numbers, and I get it's a big step up going from Holy Cross and FCS level to Big Ten football. But this is a guy that there is so much to like about his game. You kind of visualize what Nebraska wants in a quarterback, an absolute gamer, a guy who's physical, who's tough. That is Matthew Sluka. You take a look at the numbers, 5,800 passing yards, 59 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. So he takes care of the football, can get it done through the air. 3,500 rushing yards, 38 touchdowns, back-to-back seasons of over 1,000 yards. You know Nebraska wants to run the quarterback, wants to get some of that option schemes going. Matthew Sluka, when you hear the comp, Tim Tebow of the FCS, you say, okay, that's kind of a wild comp to make. You turn on the highlights of Matthew Sluka, and it all makes sense. I mean, this guy is running without his helmet, making plays lower in the shoulder. I don't think I saw him slide one time during when I was watching him play at Holy Cross. Tough as nails, can get it done through the air, but most importantly, a guy that when it's time to put your shoulder down and go kind of find some hard yards, Matthew Sluka is that guy. So again, maybe a little bit more of an under-the-radar guy, but I have a feeling Nebraska fans will really, really like what they see in Matthew Sluka, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has some Power 5 suitors because this guy at the end of the day is an absolute gamer. And you picture what you want as a quarterback for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, Matthew Sluka certainly would be one of those guys. Now, the next position I want to talk about is that wide receiver position, and specifically just some experience, right? And there's a couple of guys to look at. The one guy that is getting some buzz to Nebraska is Diont Deus, a former 5-star from the state of Texas in that 2020 class, had some legal issues, kicked off the team, went to junior college, currently has, I believe, 1,300 receiving yards at the JUCO rank. Kind of similar to how we talked about Eric Gilbert in terms of a true generational talent. You take a look at what he was doing coming out of high school, a 4.4 40, a 41-inch vertical, 6'3", 190 pounds. I mean, this guy has the capability of being an all-American wide receiver. Obviously, some off-the-field issues. And you look at Eric Gilbert, you took a flyer on him. It didn't really work out. And it's just sad to see. At the end of the day, Diont Deus might be worth another flyer. And you look at the wide receiver position, this isn't necessarily me saying this wide receiver group is bad. It just kind of lacks experience, right? When Marcus Washington and IGC and Billy Kemp dealt with injuries, and there were a lot of true freshmen that you were having to rely on at the wide receiver position. I expect those guys to take steps heading into the 2024 season, but you might want to add some talent and depth to that wide receiver room. The good thing for Nebraska in this particular position is there's going to be a ton of talent, notably at the wide receiver position that's hitting the transfer portal. If there's positions that you want to find talent, high quality talent, it's running back and wide receiver. Harder to find quarterbacks. It's harder to find offensive linemen, but there's going to be plenty of talent at that wide receiver position. You look at Diont Deus, 2 teams have offered him out of junior college, Toledo and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And if Nebraska has done their background on some of the off-the-field stuff and feel comfortable bringing him in, when you talk about high upside, Diont Deus has that in spades. I certainly would be excited if they were to bring a guy like Diont Deus in because the traits are absolutely off the chart. Now, the last position I want to talk about, there's some other positions you could go to. You obviously lose guys like Heinrich and Reimer at the linebacker position. I'm pretty comfortable with what Nebraska has on the defensive side of the ball. You have Nash and Ty Robinson coming back, Cam Leinart and Principal U, MJ Sherman, guys who you really feel comfortable about the personnel on the defensive side of the ball. And that's not to say Matt Rhule is not going to go and grab some guys on the defense, but I think a lot of the effort and a lot of the focus will be getting on offensive talent at the quarterback position, the wide receiver position, and finally, that offensive line position. And I want to go, and this is probably by far the hardest position to get quality starters in through the transfer portal. And I'm going to go up to the School of Michigan and talk about 2 guys that these are the kind of guys I think you should look at in terms of offensive linemen coming in the portal. Guys that were behind just really good players. Michigan might send 7 guys to the NFL draft on the offensive line. That means 2 guys who are not starting will still be playing in the NFL next year. that just speaks to the depth and talent that Michigan had. And if you get a Michigan offensive lineman, these guys are going to be extremely well developed, and you kind of trust that they're going to come in and compete for a starting job right away. Now, the two guys we're going to mention as a Michigan fan are not yet in the transfer portal, but I certainly could see entering the portal as they're going into their either fourth or fifth year and maybe not a clear avenue to starting. The first one I want to go to is Jeff Percy from the state of California, been at Michigan since that 2020 year, a guy that I've seen play in the spring game. One of those guys that you think would start at most Power 5 schools, just not starting at Michigan. If he hits the transfer portal, I think Nebraska should certainly be in the mix for that. And again, not one of those guys that just didn't start his first year and wants to hit the portal. He's a guy that's been developed, been with this program, has stuck it out, just hasn't really found a starting spot on that Michigan offensive line. And that speaks more to where Michigan is as an offensive line, not as much Jeff Percy, not a Power 5 starter. And the other guy I would think about is Ree Adar from the state of Colorado. Again, a little bit more of a closer proximity. Been there since the 2020 year, plays that interior offensive line, can play guard, can play center. And at the end of the day, I think Nebraska fans have learned this as well. It's important to not only have 5 quality starters, but having a ton of depth on the offensive line is extremely important. Right? It is really hard to go a 12-week season and not have injuries on that offensive line. So getting not only 5 starters, but 8 or 9 guys that you feel comfortable playing football for you is really important. Jeff Percy, Ree Adar, 2 guys that, again, as a Michigan fan, I'm very familiar with, I think would be phenomenal players for Nebraska to target if they do enter the transfer portal. I guess my point is these are the kind of guys that I would be going after. It is guys that were solid recruits, have been developed at really good schools, just haven't really been able to find starting spots because that Michigan offensive line is so deep. We're going to get a clearer picture of Nebraska and who they should be going after in the transfer portal as the weeks go on and as people enter into the transfer portal. Again, you're starting to see names trickle in. You're going to see the names flood in when that portal opens December 4th. Nebraska going to have a ton of opportunity to revamp this roster. And Matt Rhule is not going to be a guy that's going to go out and consistently get 20-plus guys in the transfer portal because you know Matt Rhule's recipe, right? Rome wasn't built in one day. He said that multiple times in his press conference. He wants to recruit out of the high school ranks, develop these guys, but at certain spots, like you would be foolish not to add some talent and depth through the transfer portal. And I think there are certain positions like that quarterback, wide receiver, and offensive line spots where Nebraska could really use getting some bodies in there to add some competition, to add some depth. That's what I got for us for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Really excited to see what Matt Rhule does. I do think he'll be aggressive in revamping this roster in the transfer portal. We'll be covering it every step of the way. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas as usual. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.